folks, my name is Heather and this is a nature channel focused on all things related to nature. Now today's video is about Jane Goodall, and this is kind of the first of an unofficial series of videos that I'm going to be putting out in a sequence together. I basically want to talk about Jane Goodall and her contributions to science, chimpanzee ecology, and then there's a particular piece of history that's related to Jane's troops that I think is just an interesting story to tell. And so those are kind of like the next three videos that I will be churning out at a snail's pace as usual. Because, 40-hour-a-week job, I like to play games. I gotta fit in eating and exercising in there somewhere. So that's just the schedule that I'm on, where it's snail's pace, guys, okay? Just bear with me. And if you are the first person to comment on what Jane saw the chimpanzees fishing for, you'll be the pinned comment in today's video. Just to kind of talk about her upbringing and her origin story, Jane's full name is Valerie Jane Morris Goodall, and she was born April 3rd, 1934. And her father's name is Mortimer Herbert, which just sounds very like you're from the UK, you're from England. That is where she's from. I just haven't told you that yet. But his name is Mortimer Herbert Morris Goodall, and he was a businessman. Her mother is Margaret Myfonway Joseph, who is an author, and she authored several books under the name Van Morris Goodall. And she was brought up in a pretty normal middle-class household. And as I kind of alluded to with the father's name, she is from England. The specific town is a coastal town called Bournemouth. And when she was growing up, this was considered a very sleepy fisherman town. It eventually kind of evolved to a resort town because now it's known for nightclubs and various health spas that are there. And Jane's mother recalls her being very interested in nature and animals at a very young age. Jane would say things like she wants to live in Africa so she could be with all the animals. And Jane's mother hated that. She would smack her upside the head, be like, what the heck? That's not what women do. They're supposed to be at home making babies. I'm just kidding. I can't joke about that for some reason. Jane even gives her mom credit for doing the best thing you can as a parent, which is nurturing the interests of your child, even if you yourself aren't interested in those interests yourself. But so the way that her mother would nurture those interests was by taking Jane out to areas in Bournemouth that have more of the nature landscape. So things like the Christchurch Harbor or the Valleyway Stour. I'm not really too sure. How do you say that? Stour? The Valleyway Stour. She would take Jane out there, and Jane was like a biologist in the making because Jane was content by just finding a log, a stump, a rock, a bench, whatever, and sitting there and she just wanted to watch the animals do their thing. And there's also a famous story about Jane in her hen house, so I will let her tell you that story.
I think I started wanting to learn about animals when I was very, very young. Happened when I was 4.5 years old. We went to stay on a farm in the country, my mother and me, and I was given a job of helping to collect the hens' eggs. And so I was collecting the eggs, but then apparently I was asking everybody, but here's the egg. Where's the hole on the hen big enough for the egg to come out? And there were about 6 of these little hen houses, and I went into an empty one and waited, and waited, and waited. And finally, I was rewarded, and a hen came in. I can close my eyes and see her now. She raised up a little on her legs, and plop, out came the egg onto the straw. And I don't know who's more excited, me. My poor mother had no idea where I was. I'd been gone for 4 hours, and she'd even called the police. But nevertheless, when she saw this excited little girl rushing towards the house, instead of getting angry at me, how dare you go off without telling us, which would have killed the excitement, she sat down to listen to the wonderful story of how a hen lays an egg. So I tell that story for a reason, because there you have the making of a little scientist. Curiosity, asking questions, not getting the right answer, deciding to find out for yourself, making a mistake, but not giving up and learning patience. It was all there, and a different kind of mother might have crushed that early curiosity, and I might not have done what I've done.
Now, her father also participated in the whole nurturing process. And when Jane was young, her dad gave her this stuffed chimpanzee animal that he named Jubilee. And she still has that stuffed animal to this day. However, I don't think she actually, I think Jubilee has kind of like retired and isn't really seen in the public facing front with Jane. Because the thing is like, as I was compiling video footage of Jane to make this video, I often saw her with this stuffed animal. And it's a chimpanzee and it's got a little banana, but it looks very different to the Jubilee stuffed animal that she was carrying around all the time. So I think whatever stuffed animal this is that she's carrying around kind of in present day, I think that is the stand-in for Jubilee. And at one time, maybe she was carrying Jubilee around a lot more, but I think Jubilee, like the OG Jubilee, is kind of retired at the moment. Okay, so we have some knowledge of how Jane was at a very young age, but from like elementary school all the way through high school, we really don't know what she was doing with herself. There really wasn't a whole lot of information outside of she had a very normal upbringing and she was pretty decent in school. And I didn't see anything that said like she was striving to be anything in particular when she grew up, you know, right? Because it's like one thing to have an interest in something when you're a young kid and maintain that interest even into adulthood, but then like you pursue a career path that is very different. I didn't really see any information about that. But what I do know is she didn't go to university right away, just simply because she and the rest of her family couldn't afford to put her into school. So when she was college age, she spent some time working for this film production company. And then it did sound like she eventually went to a secretarial school. So in 1957, it sounded like she was going to some kind of like after party, happy hour where a bunch of her schoolmates were there. And she had met this schoolmate that invited her to this farm that her family has in Kenya. And she eagerly accepted that invitation. And this wasn't like she was going to spend like a couple days there, a week or whatever. Jane was there for months. And we know that she stayed there for a couple of months because in her biography, it says that Jane eventually met Dr. Louis Leakey in Kenya. And Dr. Louis Leakey is this famed anthropologist, paleontologist who already had a lot of groundbreaking research under his belt by the time he met Jane. So I'm gonna butcher this, but he found a fossil that was eventually named Zinjanthropus boisei, and then also Homo habilis. And those two kind of combined are some of the oldest fossils on record. They're dating between 2 to 2.3 million years old. He was one of the first anthropologists, paleontologists that kind of brought up the idea that humans, as in animals existing under the genus Homo, were concurrently coexisting with other hominid type species. So that would be your Zinjanthropus boisei. So those are just some of the accomplishments that he had already achieved by the time he met Jane. But it just so happens that at the time that he met Jane, he was working on this research project about chimpanzees. This was in 1956, 1957. At that time, we actually didn't know a whole lot about chimpanzees, not only on like a species level, but we also didn't realize how closely in our ancestral history humans are to chimpanzees. So the objective to his research was to gain insight on our evolutionary past by looking at chimpanzees. Dr. Leakey and Jane got along really well, and he was quoted as saying that he liked her because she wasn't jaded by academia. So he hired her thinking that she would provide...
Because I could answer all his questions about animals, he was very impressed, and he's the one who gave me the opportunity to go and live with chimpanzees.
Leakey felt women made better observers. And I think, if you think back over women's role in evolution, we needed to be good mothers, and for that you need to be patient. You need to understand the wants and needs of a non-speaking little creature, and you really need to gauge the the relationship between the family members so that little Tommy can be kept away from Uncle Joe if Uncle Joe's in a bad mood.
Right.
So she didn't start this assistantship right away. And we know that because she met him in like 1956, 1957. And then it wasn't until 1960 that she went back down to Africa to start studying the chimpanzees. So probably between those 2 years, there was a lot of paper pushing, and he probably just had to like secure the funds to actually, get this research going. But what we do know is in 1960, she arrived at what is now known as the Gombe Stream Research Center. And this is located in the Gombe National Park, right along Lake Tanganyika, I want to say it's called. And we know this was a couple of years later because it wasn't until 1960 that she kind of first started doing her observations of the chimpanzees. So in 1960, she arrives in Gombe. And she is studying this troop of chimpanzees that eventually became known as the Kasakila community or the Kasakila troop, depending on how you want to name a group of chimpanzees. I usually go with troop. I think that's kind of the old school name to call a group of chimpanzees. So again, with that fresh perspective and the lack of academia influence, Jane started to do her research, and right off the bat, she was implementing some unconventional practices. So first, she acted like she was just a neighbor to this chimpanzee community. Typically, in those days, biologists would go into like the natural habitat where these animals are, would observe them from afar, almost like an unseen observer, so that they weren't interfering with any of the natural behaviors of the animal at the time, whatever animal it was that they were studying. So that would be like, you're not interrupting any kind of mating, interrupting a conflict, interrupting hunting, anything like that. So traditionally, you are just kind of standoffish in your research approach, but that's not how Jane approached this research at all. She wasn't standoffish. In addition to that, she named her test subjects, when normally you identify them as numbers. And again, it's so you don't get attached to them. But even though she got criticized about that, it is believed that those unconventional things that she did unlocked certain behaviors in chimpanzees that you probably wouldn't have been able to see if you were a standoffish observer. And because she named her specimens, she was really able to quickly establish personalities that were associated with, the chimps that she was studying. One of her favorite chimps to this day is David Graybeard. Now, he was recognizable because it seems as though he has a gray beard. And she described his temperament as being very tolerant, patient, and a little bit of a peacekeeper within the community. So she often saw him almost acting like a mediator when chimps were observed having conflicts. And he had this particularly close bond with a chimp named Goliath. And I couldn't tell from my sources on Goliath's specific temperament, but Jane spoke about how she often saw David Graybeard kind of like caressing Goliath's head in a very like calming manner. And when a human is caressing somebody's head, it's like, you're trying to calm them down because maybe they're anxious. You're trying to give them some condolences because they're sad. Maybe you're trying to calm them down when they're mad. Goliath probably could have been any of those temperaments, generally depressed and sad, maybe anxious. Maybe he was a more aggressive chimp, although I didn't see anything that gave me the idea that he was an aggressive chimp. I got more of the impression that maybe he was an anxious chimp. And so David, like I said, was oftentimes maybe trying to give him a little bit of comfort. Now, David was an older chimpanzee, and this was probably one of the reasons why he kind of acknowledged her existence. He was actually one of the first chimpanzees to acknowledge her existence. Probably just trying to check out to see if she was like a perceived threat to the rest of the community. When it was discovered that she wasn't a threat, he became very friendly with her, so much so that he would bring members of his troop to the research center to meet with Jane. So he would like introduce his troop members to Jane. And this is one of the reasons why she was able to name so many of the troop members. But in those beginning days, there really wasn't much that was like groundbreaking, but she didn't see anything that would like shock the world until One day in the fall in 1960, Jane recounts seeing David Graybeard take a twig, break it off of a tree, then strip the leaves off of that twig so that now he has this like flexible stick essentially. And he took that stick and put it into a hole in a termite mound, made this scooping motion, pulled it out. This time the stick was covered with termites, and so he turned that stick into a tool to acquire food. This was the first time we ever saw an animal use tools. Up until this time, we thought that something that made humans special was that we use tools. We know now chimps use tools for many different things. They use other tools outside of the stick. They will make toys to entertain their young. And they even use multiple tools in sequence to achieve a certain goal. So they would use a tool to get from point A to point B, and then another tool would get them from point B to C. This discovery alone led Dr. Leakley to say one of his famous quotes, which is, "Now we must redefine tool. We must redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans." And of course, we see animals using tools all the time now. This is not something that is special to primates. Elephants will use stick-like things and unsavory appendages to scratch themselves. Octopuses will take shells and encase themselves to protect them from threats. And outside of those specific examples, so many animals will use tools to catch prey, construct shelters, attract mates, defend themselves. Like even Jane said after this discovery, we find animals doing things that we, in our arrogance, used to think was just being human. And that is that humans aren't really all that special. And that's not to downplay some of our achievements or whatever. It's to kind of keep us level-headed, I think. Because you see so many, the Bezos and the Elons of the world, they want to leave planet Earth to look for intelligence elsewhere. And Jane is basically saying the intelligence is right here, like literally tens of millions of examples of intelligence that Earth has right here that we can see. We are just like them. They are just like us. And so as I talk more about her discoveries and really just in general, since I do like to talk about animal ecology on this channel, hopefully you will see that there is a lot of overlap between not only chimps, but other animals. And maybe you could begin to understand why conservationists and animal rights advocates advocate for not only chimpanzees, but several other animals deserve this idea of personhood, that they should be treated as individuals with individual rights. She eventually also found that chimpanzees would hunt and eat meat. This was at a time when scientists thought that they were pretty much vegetarian, that they didn't hunt and eat meat at all. And this is actually something that blew my dad's mind because, mind you, he was maybe like anywhere between 10 or 14 when these discoveries were happening in real time. And I have pretty much been a vegetarian all throughout my whole life. There's been starts and stops here and there. But when I didn't have like the choice and the money to like buy the vegetarian options and stuff, my dad would say stuff to me like, Heather, chimps are smarter than gorillas, and we think it's because they eat meat, because that was kind of one of the running hypotheses at the time. But it still is a very small portion of their diet. It only makes up like 1 to 6% of their diet. What I do want to note though, because if you look at humans in more of like the natural settings, so I'm talking about like outside of the global industrialized complex, eating meat is very much so part of their diet, definitely more than the 1 to 6% or whatever. And so like I immediately saw a huge difference between meat consumption in chimps and how they share with their community and meat consumption in humans. So let me just describe kind of like the difference there. With humans, let's say you have a tribe that is, 75 individuals. Each day, a subset of that tribe will go out to hunt. Others will forage. So like whatever, they'll be doing things. But we're just talking about the hunters right now. So a subset of the community will go out and if they get a kill, they'll bring that kill back to the community, oftentimes totally exhausted because sometimes they have to go out miles on end before they actually are able to successfully hunt something. So they're tired and exhausted. So they kind of tag team in another set of the community, and they will skin, gut, and cut the pieces of meat that are going to be there for dinner. And depending on how large the animal is, they're probably going to be pretty tired. It could take hours to do that. So then that group, they tag team in another subset of the community to cook. And at the end of the day, everybody within the community has equal access to the resources, even if they weren't involved in the hunting, the killing, the preparing, or the cooking part that day. And it's because tomorrow they might be involved in it, right? For chimps, it seems like sharing still does happen. But what Jane was observing was like, if a chimp had a successful kill, he'd be there in his little corner like fucking Gollum or whatever, eating his meat, and the chimp really wouldn't share the meal until other chimpanzees from the troop would come by and they start to display like this begging or bargaining type behavior, and then he'd be like, oh, okay, fine, you can have some meat. So I just kind of thought that was interesting because like with humans, it seems like the access to the meat is definitely like this communal entitlement, and with chimpanzees are just like, pretty please, can you please share with me? So keep in mind, all of these discoveries were happening at a time when Jane wasn't in school still. She was just an assistant for Dr. Leakey's research. But a year goes by and she finally went to Cambridge University, where she went straight into her doctoral program. This is something that is still very rare to this day. At the very least, you have to have your bachelor's degree, and you could skip over getting your master's and go right into the doctorate degree. But to go straight into your doctoral program without a bachelor's degree is very, very rare, even still to this day. But she earned her PhD in ethology, which is the study of animal behavior. And so, of course, as part of her PhD program, she continued to research the Casakila troop in Gombe, and she was able to show the world through that research that chimpanzees have very complex social interactions, personality traits, familiar bonds, and they can be territorial. And I'll elaborate more on those things in the videos that are to come, because I really just want to focus more on Jane for right now. This all took place in the 1960s when women were still being told, like, just go and have babies, be a homemaker. That's what's going to make you feel fulfilled. And if it doesn't make you feel fulfilled, we're going to lobotomize you. So it does. I'm not kidding. So Jane really opened up the door for women who were not finding that kind of lifestyle to be fulfilling, and they wanted to pursue the science field. Very shortly after Jane became this household name, other women like Diane Fossey and Beirut Galdikis emerged into the field of primatology. And quickly, more and more, we started seeing animals are just like us. Even outside of primates, several examples of animals displaying behavior that's very similar to how we behave. Eventually, Jane Goodall met a Dutch wildlife photographer named Hugo van Lawlik, and they married in 1964. And then Jane had a son named Hugo with that husband. And that was in 1967 when she had her son. Now, Jane and her husband did eventually divorce, but she went on to marry for a second time in 1975 to a gentleman named Derek Bryson, and he was the director of Tanzania's national parks. However, after only being married for 5 years, he lost a battle to an aggressive form of cancer. And so he left poor Jane widowed at the age of 45, 46. Now, Jane describes this point in her life being one of the darkest moments of her life. And if you don't really know too much about Jane, she is like the epitome of hope. She is essentially the symbolism of hope. And this is one of the first times that she talks about how she actually started to lose a lot of hope because of the grieving process was just taking her into such a dark place. So it sounds like she was in Africa at the time that she lost her second husband. And after the loss of her husband, she went back to England to her house. where I can just imagine poor Jane at like 45, 46 years old, just kind of moping around, doing what you would do after losing someone very special to you. And she said that she oftentimes just found comfort in hanging out with her dog. Like she would be there in bed just crying, and her dog would just be resting his head right on her lap to give her some form of comfort. But eventually she realized that she needed to get herself out of this, and one of the ways she got herself out of this darkness and hopelessness is by going back to Gombe. And she speaks on this time going back to Gombe to get her out of this grieving process. She said, quote, "It gives me a sense of peace and timelessness and reminded me of the cycle of life and death we all go through." And so it was here that she realized that she didn't really like lose hope for good. She just started to kind of lose sight of it. And as I said, like Jane Goodall, she is the epitome of hope. And at 90 years old, she is still spreading that message. And when you think about it, she's not a dimwit to some of the biggest stories that are happening in the world. Like, she's well aware of climate change, unsustainable impacts due to unsustainable human numbers. She speaks on the factory farming all the time now. She knows all of these things are going to result in civilization collapsing. And how the hell this woman is still able to preach this message about hope blows my freaking mind. Seriously. However, in reading more about this time in Jane's life and just kind of like her messages in general, I actually realized that I have hope. And I'm going to elaborate, but on the topic of hope, she says, quote, "Hope teaches us that we can't run away from the darkness because the darkness will eventually find us. Only by facing our grief can we heal, allowing the fog to clear, the darkness to lift, and the stars to become visible once again." So I feel like I am living in the doomosphere. I feel like humans are in for a world of hurt in the coming future, definitely within my lifetime. But there's certain things that I just can't let go. And I always viewed that as like, whatever, fuck it, this is the hill I'm dying on. So the biosphere collapsing is like one of my greatest heartbreaks. And I've even been told to my freaking face that I just need to let it go. Like, they're doomed. Just forget about them, right? I can't let it go. So I know I donate regularly to conservation groups. If I ever see an animal that needs a helping hand, I try to give it to them. And I am continually involved in volunteer efforts to restore habitat. And I'm realizing that the fact that I can't let it go, that is me expressing hope. Like, I am hoping my little efforts will have an animal or a species get through that bottleneck that they're going through with the 6th mass extinction, where maybe there's some individuals that are going to survive it in the end when they actually come out to the other side. So all of the efforts that I'm doing, even though I think we're in for some very dark times and I'm going to be grieving the loss of wildlife for the rest of my life, I am really hoping that my efforts are reducing the number of species that are going extinct. So I don't know if that resonated with you, because it's kind of like nice to know that I actually have a little bit of hope, even though I've always perceived hope as being like this very naive thing, right? As in hope without action. What's nice about environmental work is you can express your hope in a form of action, right? Like, you hope to see plastic use be reduced. So as an expression of that hope, you reduce your plastic use yourself. But I would like to know if any of that did resonate with you. Like, is there something that you really care about? And sure, you think maybe the circumstances are utterly hopeless, but you kind of are taking these actions that are an expression of hope. So what is it, and what are your expressions of hope? I truly would love to know about it in the comments down below. Some 40 years later, Jane was interviewed about her loss of her husband in 2020. And she speaks on why she never married again. And she pretty much said that she didn't want to, or she didn't meet the right person, or someone who was potentially the right person. Basically saying that she's got plenty of friends and acquaintances around her, both male and female, and that her life is filled, like, she feels pretty good and complete. So it's never been an interest for her to go ahead and marry again. Speaking on some of the other things that went on with her life, from late 1970s to basically current day, Jane has been involved with a lot of public relations type work, which is super critical in the scientific field. She has founded organizations, produced documentaries, authored books, and she has been invited to speak to very large audiences globally. Before I go into a little bit more of Jane's achievements, particularly talking about the Jane Goodall Institute, I do just want to say that she hasn't been without controversy. So I want to talk about some of those controversies. The first one, and the biggest one really, seems to be that in 2013, she faced accusations of plagiarism for her book called Seeds of Hope. The Washington Post published a story on the book before this book was even published, citing that there were several phrases and even entire paragraphs that were borrowed from websites, including Wikipedia, which I know in 2013 was not considered a legitimate source. And that overall, all of these like borrowed phrases and paragraphs weren't properly cited or weren't given footnotes. Typically, when you are the lead author, particularly if it's like a published article for like a professional journal, the lead author is responsible for vetting the data, all the general information, and conflicts of interest. Since Jane was kind of like the lead author on this book, she should have been able to see some of that plagiarism and should have been able to correct it like before the book was even published. While it was not really apparent who was responsible for grabbing these passages and phrases and stuff like that, meaning nobody really knew if it was Jane herself or some of her co-authors were incorporating some of that plagiarized information. But regardless, Jane did release a statement saying, "This was a long and well-researched book, and I am distressed to discover that some of the excellent and valuable sources were not properly cited. I want to express my sincerest apologies." And as always, some people are going to sit there and say it's not good enough, while other people are going to say that, you know, that type of apology is sufficient enough. But some people thought that she did not take enough responsibility, meaning they felt like she should have been able to catch the plagiarism and not let the book go out like that. And that was largely the scientific community felt that way, because it did kind of start to prompt the discourse that science just in general is becoming more and more competitive, especially when it comes to applying for grants. During the time that this happened with her book, there was this uptick of plagiarized work within the academic setting. So people were plagiarizing work, data, conclusions, all that stuff. And it's pretty much because there's so much more pressure to get funds and publish as much as you can. And of course, there's like this ego side of it all where people are working harder and taking work from others because they feel like they deserve a certain recognition. And of course, there's also like this ego thing that's playing into it, or I guess prestige, where people are more often plagiarizing certain work because they're hoping that they will get the recognition that they feel like they deserve. But generally speaking, because this book was written for kind of the lay person, most people believe that her apology was sincere. It really was an honest mistake, and she has since fixed that stuff in any of the books that have gone out to be published. But at the time when she released that apology, she just said that she kind of like fixed whatever was needed on the Jane Goodall Institute website. The second thing, remember when I said that when she was doing her studies in the 1960s, she was acting more like this neighbor rather than an unseen observer? Yeah, people didn't like that. And this was mostly because people believe that you really need to minimize any kind of potential harm and reduce behavioral disturbances. So like I said, like, you want to make sure you're not interrupting, you know, a lion going in for his kill, any kind of mating behaviors, things like that. The other thing, though, is the potential for disease transmission. We didn't know at the time in the 1960s because we didn't know that much about chimpanzees in general, but pretty much like any disease that humans are able to catch, chimpanzees can catch too, and vice versa. So she's really lucky there wasn't some kind of disease that was going around and that could have resulted in her getting extremely sick, or you know, a whole bunch of the chimpanzee troop members getting sick. And I don't think that criticism is really all that outlandish, but it does seem like currently she is practicing research, and everybody that's involved in like her research with the Jane Goodall Institute is practicing kind of that harm reduction and the potential for disease transmission. I tried looking for this video that I remember watching when I was like in high school, and it was like a 60 minutes bit or whatever. And I know Jane was probably in her 50s or something at the time, but she was visiting the chimps once again in Gombe. And I remember seeing this footage of this older male chimpanzee who's really, really skinny. They actually knew that he was dying of cancer. But at the same time, like a bout of pneumonia was going around in the community. And so Jane, like, expressly said that she's keeping her distance just to avoid any kind of disease transmission that might take place. And so I do think that her approach has kind of evolved over time, where she understands that there's some risk and she wants to reduce any kind of harm that she could cause to the animals by, you know, certain protocols. Now, the naming part, like naming your test subjects, seems to be more incorporated into science even to this day. By naming the animals, it kind of put this more human element into conservation so that people actually cared about the animals a lot more. So that ended up actually being like a good contribution to conservation. And the third one is she is a patron to Population Matters, which is a UK-based sustainable population advocacy group. So, you know, she's part of the secret government agenda to kill us all. This one I just will never get. I've mentioned in videos before that I'm a sustainable population advocate. Governments everywhere are incentivizing you to have kids with tax breaks, limiting access to abortions. Religions are telling their followers to have more kids and pretty much go forth and multiply. Even recently, like a couple of weeks ago, Russia is planning to fine people who promote the child-free lifestyle. Yep, the government and the elites want to depopulate us all. Please tell me on this figure where the depopulation is happening. I swear to God, the overpopulation denialism is going to kill us all. And really, depending on the extent in which you value life, it kind of already is. And the last bit I'm kind of clumping together as miscellaneous because, like, I heard about them maybe in like articles that were about a different topic, but then when I would try to find an article that was specifically talking about these controversies, I couldn't find anything. So apparently there was some collaboration work that she did with a Canadian oil company for a conservation project, and of course people were just like, well, why are you like in bed with the enemy? But I really didn't find anything related to that conservation project. So I just kind of reached the dead end there. The other thing is she has voiced support for alternative medicines. Now, I do a lot of foraging, and I'm reading about how Native people use plants around my local area for medicinal purposes. So I think it's one thing if Jane is maybe supporting something like that, and it's another thing if she's saying like crystals will heal us all or whatever. But I couldn't find any information on if it was like, you know, supporting medicinal plants that ancient people used to use versus like something woo-woo like crystal use. So take all that with a grain of salt. Despite all of these controversies, they were minimal at best, and she corrected them when she was confronted by them, like the plagiarism instance. But overall, these really haven't tainted her reputation too much. In 1977, she founded the Jane Goodall Institute, which is focused on continuing research. And it turns out that the facility that she was first doing research in the 1960s is now officially called the Gombe Stream Research Center. And to this day, this facility is used by many researchers, including native Tanzanians. In addition, the Jane Goodall Institute is empowering African people living in chimp habitat. Jane was really one of the first people to realize that in order to make conservation meaningful, you've got to take care of the local people. So through the Jane Goodall Institute, she does work to get people to generate income, like beekeeping or through pooling money that's seeded by the Jane Goodall Institute funds so that people can start businesses and become less dependent on the surrounding ecosystem, leading to deforestation and overexploitation. For example, one woman received a loan to create a nursery around her community. The woman was then able to generate an income by selling the seeds from the trees that she planted around her community. Also, the Jane Goodall Institute educates people on economics and reducing family sizes so people can live within their economic means, and as a result, they do not have to resort resort to poaching or deforestation to support their families. She has gone on to publish a ton of books, made appearances in films and documentaries, and still is very much so involved in activism. In 1991, Jane established the Roots and Shoots org, and the intent of Roots and Shoots was to initiate grassroots movements with the focus on getting the youth involved. And the idea is that when you look at things globally, it's sort of like, oh my God, this problem is so much bigger than myself. And
don't. If you think globally, you become filled with gloom. But if you take a little piece of this whole picture, my piece, our piece, this is what I can do here. I'm making a difference. And hi, wow, they're making a difference over there. And so are they, and so are they. And so gradually the pieces get filled in and the world is a better place because of you.
And so if you do go on the website, there's kind of a couple different models, I guess you could say. There's there's projects that are called projects in a box where you can take action right away. You don't have to wait for a group to form. Like there's one project that's called I Dream a Green. And this is where they kind of walk you through the process of how you can make an area that's vacant in your city more green. Like, how do you contact the people to get permission to actually plant a tree, or maybe you could plant a community garden there. So there's a couple of projects like that where you could just like get to action right away. But otherwise, it seems like a lot of projects are created through classrooms. So like teachers will start a project and the classroom will work on it together, or families will work on those projects. So for example, I saw that there was a family, and I'm guessing it was a family because all the members had the same last name and it was like only 5 individuals. But they were focused on saving Australian wildlife. And what they wanted to do is make it so that they could create some kind of brochure with a whole bunch of information on how to save Australian wildlife. And I could see in their project folder that they got in contact with a couple of wildlife rehab centers as well as some conservation groups, and they, had a Zoom call with them to get the information that they need, and then they were able to kind of publish this informational packet. Now, that's a project that had kind of like an end to it, but there are other projects where it's a group and the efforts are ongoing and they're kind of constantly working on various things. So I'll leave links to the Jane Goodall Institute and Roots and Shoots in case you're interested in seeing what those organizations are all about. And if you want to start a project of your own through Roots and Shoots, then you can go ahead and check it out. With that aside, though, it does seem like the Jane Goodall Institute is kind of like where she gets most of her funding to do all of the things that she wants to do, on top of being invited to speak to massively large audiences globally. But in recent years, it seems like she is mostly doing the public speaking portion. Like, it sounds like she's not, she's traveling to go and speak and stuff, but she's not traveling to do a whole bunch of research through the Jane Goodall Institute. So even at 91, like she's going to be 91 in April, she still feels like there is the need to keep spreading her message. And she was invited to the Today Show just last year for her 90th birthday. And this is what she said on why she needs to continue spreading her message.
Her advocacy for conservation continues no matter what.
Well, it has to, because look at the state the world's in. Look at how there's deforestation, climate change, loss of biodiversity, poverty, and all the other things, the industrial farming. So it's really important to get the message out. Slow down, Jane, you're 90. I've got to speed up because I don't know how many years left I have.
Oh, it's going to be a long time. Listen to
So yeah, that's unbelievable. She won't stop pretty much until she's dead. And to be honest, I get it. That's what environmentalists do. She was asked, like, what does she want to leave as part of her legacy? And what I do appreciate in her response is she thinks that she has already left her legacy. Like, she could die tomorrow and she'd pretty much be happy with what she has left behind. Because I think if we all think about our legacy, it oftentimes seems like it's something that's like a work in progress and it's kind of in the future, like it's not completed yet. But she pretty much said, her work with the chimpanzees, getting people to care about conservation and continuing to spread this message of hope is what she feels like her legacy has already achieved. Like, she's already there. And you know what? It shows. Through the Jane Goodall Institute, 3.4 million acres of habitat are under conservation action plans. 482 papers have been published by researchers utilizing the Gombe Stream Research Center. 290 chips and gorillas are in sanctuaries supported by the Jane Goodall Institute. 130 African countries are getting their basic needs met without having to poach, deforest, or do something illegal to support their families. And hey, if you need a tangible symbol of hope, Jubilee, remember that stuffed chimpanzee I told you about? Her dad gave her when she was really young? Well, a replica of that stuffed plushie is available to purchase to remind you about how it all started. That's going to do it for today, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more from me, and we will see you in the next one. Bye.
This is a really exciting moment for me. Here is Wunda, and she nearly died, but thanks to Rebecca, she came back from the dead almost.